Hi, this is Sheila with the latest episode of the Communicate Influence podcast. And this episode is definitely one for writers. It's with Josh Steimle, who's a writer, author, TEDx speaker, and so much more. Josh's second book, 60 Days to LinkedIn Mastery, comes out this spring. But it's his third book, The 7 Systems of Influence, that he's excited and passionate about. This interview is a special one for me because I've been reading Josh's blog and articles for a long time now. He's contributed articles to my website, and I've wanted to have him as a guest on the show for some time. He's a really great person and someone who's generous with his time and knowledge. In fact, he's even offered to answer writers' questions related to this episode, so how good is that? Josh and I talk about writing, writers, books, and Josh's work. Importantly, Josh gives some good advice on how to become a better writer and the key things to consider if you want to get your book published. If you're enjoying the podcast and getting a lot from it, consider giving a small tip at buymeacoffee.com or via Patreon. And we'll have all the links for this episode in the show notes.
This is Josh Steimle, founder of Influencer Inc. and sponsor of this episode of the Communicate Influence podcast. As a listener, you get a 50% discount on my online course, 60 Days to LinkedIn Mastery. This course gives you just one short and simple email a day so you don't get overwhelmed, but you still make consistent progress. It walks you step by step through how to optimize your LinkedIn profile, make high-quality connections, and create compelling content. This course is deceptively simple, but I promise you, if you go through it, at the end, you will know more than 99.99% of the people using LinkedIn. You'll be a LinkedIn master. To get this course, go to influencerinc.co. That's influencerinc.co/60 days LinkedIn. That's 60 days LinkedIn. And then use the code LinkedIn50. That's LinkedIn, the number 5, the number 0. So influencerinc.co/60 days LinkedIn. Use the code LinkedIn50 and you'll get 50% off that course. Hope to see you in there.
Josh, welcome to the Communicate Influence podcast.
Thank you, Sheila, for having me. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you.
Yeah, it's great. We've had a lot of contact over the last few years, and this is the first podcast interview that we've done, so it's good to connect.
Yes.
Now, let's, for people who don't know you or your work and your writing, tell our listeners a bit about your background and what you've been doing.
Well, I got my start as a failing entrepreneur. I started a business in 1999, a marketing agency called MWI. Basically failed my way forward. It was successful enough to keep me going, but never quite reached the success I wanted until 2013. And in 2013, I got the opportunity to write for Forbes magazine, and that changed everything. It actually saved the business. The business was nearing bankruptcy at that point, and writing for Forbes generated a ton of leads for the business. It ended up generating over $10 million in revenue for the agency, pulled us out of the dire financial straits we were in, helped us to expand worldwide. Now we have offices in Asia and other places. And it also got me really interested in the art of influence and how people can put content out there and drive people to action. And so I started doing some speaking and writing and coaching around this topic. And that's become my focus in recent years, is really just influence and personal branding and thought leadership and how this works.
That's amazing. That kind of impact from one article. What was the article about?
It was about search engine optimization. That's what my agency was doing. And what I figured out is that if you write an article in Forbes about how to hire an SEO firm, that article is going to go to the top of Google. And then when people search for how to hire an SEO firm, they see that article. And of course, who types in how to hire an SEO firm into Google? People who want to hire an SEO firm. And so we got a ton of business off that. And it wasn't just off the one article, it was others as well. But that's the article that drove the majority of our traffic from Forbes. And then I ended up that writing for Forbes opened doors so that I could write for other publications. So I ended up writing for about 24 business publications, Fortune, Mashable, TechCrunch, Fast Company, and got about 300 articles out there. And so all of that writing just really opened doors for the business. And then it led to speaking opportunities. I was able to speak at TEDx and got a book deal. And so it just opened all sorts of doors.
That's fantastic. And I know that writing is something that you really like to do. I'm sure, I don't know if passion is the right word. Do you feel passionate about it?
Absolutely. I love writing, and it's interesting to look back and see that I was always writing. Even when I was a little kid, I was writing funny stories in fourth grade, and my teacher would take them home and read them to her husband and come back and say, "Oh, we read your story. We were just laughing." But I never saw myself as a writer. And even when blogs came out, I was one of the first bloggers around 2001. I was writing tons of blog posts. I had about 1,000 blog posts on my blog. But I never thought of myself as a writer until I was approached by Forbes and they said, "Will you write for us?" And I said, "Sure." And I started writing, and I took it a little bit more seriously at that point. And that's when people started paying attention. And that's when I felt like, wow, I really found my calling here. Like, I love doing this. When I started writing for Forbes and was able to take it more seriously, I felt like I'd found my calling. I found my place. It just fit. And I was in that state of flow that people talk about. And I just absolutely have loved writing and creating blog posts and articles and books and everything. And when I'm in that writing mode, I just feel like I'm in my element.
And how would you describe your writing, your style, Josh?
Very casual, very conversational. So when I'm writing, I'm really trying to make people not pay attention to my writing. I had an experience a few years ago where I read a book actually by a relative of mine, and I was reading this book, and it was just kind of painful because he was trying to use a lot of flowery words, fancy words, and I was so distracted by the words he was using and how smart he was trying to make himself look that I wasn't really getting the content, the point of the book. And somebody told me that you should write at about a 5th grade level, not because your audience can't understand anything above a 5th grade level, but a 5th grade level is the level at which people don't really have to think about what they're reading. That is, they don't have to think about the words. They just get the message. They get the information. It flows seamlessly into their brain. And so I try to keep my writing very simple, very conversational, as though we're just chatting. And I find that people really seem to respond to that.
That's very interesting. You know, you're the second person who said that to me recently. I did a podcast last year with a writer based in Edmonton called Satya Das, and he said the very same thing. Like, try and forget about the words, which sounds like the opposite advice that you'd give to a writer, but it's so true.
Yeah. In fact, I had this interesting experience with Forbes. I wrote 164 articles for Forbes from 2013 to 2016. And I wrote enough that I was able to see a pattern between which of my articles were very successful and got lots of reading and engagement comments, and which articles didn't. And it was consistently the articles that I put the least effort into that got the biggest response. And the articles I researched the most and I spent the most time crafting what I said and exactly what words to use, those got no response. And I mean, it was every single time I would spend 45 minutes on an article and it'd be my biggest article ever. And I would go spend 12 hours on another article and it would get nothing. It was just crickets. Nobody cared about it. And so after a while, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to write what I feel like writing. I'm not going to really edit it that much. I'm not going to review it. I'm not going to think about it. And those pieces are the ones that generated all the money, got all the attention, and got me all the results.
There's a really important lesson there for people who are already writing and people who aspire to be writers. Just, focus on simplicity and get into that state of flow that you described.
Yeah, and I think perhaps it's because it came across as more authentic when I wasn't editing it so much, and perhaps that showed through and people could sense that it was what I was really thinking and it was more accessible that way. But I almost felt like I was cheating. I felt like I'm doing the opposite of what they must teach in journalism school. I've never been to journalism school, but I assume they teach you how to write really well. And I felt like I was doing kind of poor writing, and yet that's what was getting a response.
Well, I mean, I think your writing is similar. When I've read things that you've written, I enjoy it because
it is really easy to read, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have important ideas or things that make me go, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. You just present it, really in a succinct manner, and it makes complete sense when you read it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think, that's obviously what they're trying to teach people in journalism school as well. So it sounds like you've adopted that style on your own.
Well, good for me, and I didn't have to pay for it.
I'm curious, how long does it take you to get into that state of flow, or does it happen quite quickly now?
And most of the time it happens quickly. Usually there's something that sparks an idea, and I say, oh, I want to write something about that. And so I'm already in that mode or that mood right as I'm getting started. I don't have that much of a structured process in terms of when I write or how long I write for. Right now, I'm working on a book, so I did commit. I said I'm going to wake up every morning, and before I do anything else, I'm going to work for a half hour on this book. And that seems to work really well for me. But a lot of my other material, I'm not planning when I'm going to write. I might just say, you know what, I've got an hour right now. I'm going to try to write something, and I feel like writing, and I just go ahead and I write. But I've never really struggled with that process. The ideas have always flowed pretty easily for me. And so writer's block is something I just haven't had that much experience with.
And in terms of guidance to other writers, in terms of, focus and routine, do you believe that routine is really important if someone's, wants to be a better writer or is just starting?
I think practice is certainly important in that the more you write, the better you get at it. There's no doubt about that. And I think reading is also very important. The more you read, the better you are as a writer. But in terms of routine, I don't know if a routine is that important. I can't say that I've really followed any sort of routine, at least not if I have followed a routine, it's been unintentional and natural, and it's not something I do consciously. But I don't know, maybe everybody's different. Maybe routine's great for some people, and maybe for other people it's not as necessary. For me, it just doesn't seem to be something that I need, although I do need a routine if I want to be consistent about putting out content. And so if I say I'm going to write a blog post every Tuesday and put that in a newsletter and send that out, then I absolutely have to schedule that time and make sure that that happens. If I don't schedule it, it doesn't happen.
I see. Okay. Well, let's focus a little bit more on what you have been up to in the past in terms of your writing and what you're doing now. I mean, you began with, I believe the first book came out in 2016. Tell our listeners a little bit about that book, Josh.
Sure. So that book was Chief Marketing Officers at Work. And the reason I wrote that book was I was running a marketing agency, and we were trying to figure out how to market to our target audience, which is CMOs, marketing officers and VPs of marketing. And I thought, well, if I write a book for these people, then they'll know who I am, and I'll have credibility and clout with them, and that will help us to land more deals. And I was originally intending to write a book about digital marketing for the CMO. But as I started writing that book, I realized I didn't really understand CMOs or what their job was and what it was really like to be a CMO. I'd never been one myself. And so I started doing research, and I thought, well, maybe I can go read some books about CMOs. And there just aren't that many books out there. But a few years earlier, I had read a book called Founders at Work. It's by Jessica Livingston. She's with Y Combinator, an accelerator in the Bay Area. And it was a great book. And I knew that there were other books in this series, like CTOs at Work and Lawyers at Work and Venture Capitalists at Work. So I thought, well, I'll just go read the CMOs at Work book. And then I couldn't find it. And my search led me back to the publisher's website because I thought this book has to exist. Somebody has to have written this. But when I got back to the publisher's website, I realized, hey, nobody has written this book. It's nowhere. So I emailed them and said, hey, has somebody written this book? And if not, could I write this book? Because this would be great research for me to understand CMOs. So they wrote back and said, no, nobody's written it. And send us your pitch. So I basically sent them a pitch saying, hey, I've written for Forbes. I've interviewed lots of people. I know how to do business writing. And they sent me a book deal in advance. And that was my first book. And I got to interview about 30 CMOs and ask them all the questions I wanted to know about, and slapped all those interviews together in that book. And that's the book.
That's great. And is it still selling reasonably well?
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's not a bestseller. I mean, it's a very niche book. If you're not really into marketing, if that's not the focus of your career, if you're not interested in the CMO or VP of marketing path, it's probably not going to be a super interesting book for you. But it's never sold super well, but it's sold very consistently over the years. It just kind of doesn't go down. It's always kind of selling what it's always sold. And so, like Ryan Holiday says, you want to write a perennial bestseller that just keeps selling and selling and selling. And that's what it's done. So it's been nice that way.
Yeah, exactly. I remember hearing Ryan give that advice. And I think, a lot of people are looking at going into marketing or transitioning if they've started another career. So I can't imagine people not wanting to read that book. And I did listen to the audio version, Josh, and I found the breadth and depth of the work that people do in marketing fascinating. So, for me, I'm not really primarily a marketer. I'm a writer and I work in communications, but for me, it was really valuable to listen to it.
Yeah, it was interesting. And one of the questions I asked everyone was, how did you get to where you are today? How did you become a CMO? And nobody had the same story as anybody else. I mean, and I don't know if there was I think there might have been 1 out of the 30 people who said, I went to school and I studied marketing. Everybody else had some sort of other crazy path that led to them being the CMO of a company. I mean, these were CMOs at Target and Spotify and PayPal, big companies. And yet these people had routes to that top marketing position that you would look at and say, I never would have predicted that somebody would take that route to get to the top marketing position in a company.
Mm-hmm. And you started working on a second book, and I don't know the date when that happened. It could have been last year. Let's talk about that book and the different approach that you're taking with a publisher.
It's interesting. It seems like all my books are kind of serendipitous, where they happen almost on accident. And that's what happened with the second book. The second book is about LinkedIn and how to develop a personal brand on LinkedIn and engage in thought leadership on LinkedIn. And the way that one came about was I've been very active on LinkedIn for the past few years. I love writing content for LinkedIn and engaging with people there. And I've picked up some things about profile optimization and how to make connections with people and how to create content. And so I started publishing little graphics with short tips on them about just how to use LinkedIn. And I started posting these on Instagram and LinkedIn and writing up a little bit of detail to accompany each of these graphics. And as I kept creating these, I got up to finally about 60 of these tips. And I thought, gee, I could just slap these together and I've got a book here. Maybe I should do this. And I started looking into self-publishing it. But then a guy reached out to me from a company called Publishizer, and he said, hey, we have this platform where we it's kind of like crowdfunding. It's almost like a Kickstarter for books, but it's really a pre-sale platform. And so you set it up with different offers and you can give away extra things in addition to just selling books. And it's an incentive for people to pre-order your book. And then what they do is if you get enough pre-orders, which is around 500, then they look at that and say, hey, this is validation that enough people want to buy this book that a traditional publisher would be interested. And so I didn't want to do this at first, but the guy was really persistent and kept recruiting me. And I thought, okay, fine, I'll do this. I'll try it out. And I ended up getting about 625 or so pre-orders. So it put me over that threshold and I was able to get some offers and landed a deal from a traditional publisher. And so now I'm working with them and that book will come out May 2020. And so that was the path to the second book. Again, this is a book I didn't plan on writing, but it kind of wrote itself.
And clearly, the person who contacted you from Publishizer, they were obviously very keen and they must have been familiar with your work. Is that correct?
He found me on LinkedIn, and I don't know exactly how he found me. I don't know if he was following me before, but something I posted caught his attention. And when he reached out to me, he said, "Hey, I've been reading your content, and if you're going to put this together in a book, then we definitely should be talking, and you should use our platform."
Oh, that's great. And even though he contacted you, did you still have to put together a pitch?
Yes, because I had to, part of the process of using their platform is you have to put up all this information about your book and what it is. And you also have to put in information for publishers, because publishers come to this platform, and if they're interested in you and your book idea, then they'll follow you. And then when your book campaign finishes, mine was 30 days long. When your campaign wraps up, then any of the publishers who are interested get a notification about this and how many books were pre-sold, and then they can reach out to you and see if you're interested in publishing with them. So I had to write up this pitch and all sorts of details for the publishers as part of setting things up on this platform.
And just for listeners, we'll mention that website in the show notes. But back to the interview, Josh. Tell listeners what it's like using that platform and how much time you invested in your marketing campaign.
So most of the time I invested in this went into just setting things up on the platform. It was a lot of work, and it was good because it forced me to create content that I needed to create anyway for the book, for the cover and for the introduction and for marketing materials and such. So it was a good exercise, but it was a lot of time, a lot of work to get that set up. In terms of the actual marketing to drive traffic to the campaign during those 30 days, I started publishing a lot of content on LinkedIn because I figured, hey, this is a LinkedIn book. So putting content on LinkedIn to drive traffic for a LinkedIn book, that makes sense. So I put content up there. But what I found was that it was really the personal one-to-one sales, and especially bulk sales, that made the difference. So rather than going out and selling 20 pre-orders to 20 people, I was going to people I knew who were in companies and saying, hey, why don't you buy 20 books for everybody on your marketing team? Or why don't you buy a bunch of these for all of your friends in your space if you're a venture capitalist? Like, why don't you buy a bunch of these for all your portfolio companies? And so I had a lot of people that I knew in different companies who came and did bulk buys, and some it was 10, some it was 20. Some people bought, and also I was giving away incentives too. So my company has services, like we have a LinkedIn Done For You service. And so I said, hey, you can get our LinkedIn Done For You service for this discounted price if you buy 100 books. And so some people bought 100 books in order to get that discount on the service. And they figured, hey, I get a bunch of books, but I'm also getting this service that I'm interested in. And so there were ways to incentivize the sales that way.
And so obviously all the work that you've done in the past, the contacts that you've made, the places that you've spoken at, the speeches that you've given, they really helped make those sales and your personal touch a success, didn't they?
Yes. And one thing I would be remiss to not mention is that I have an email list. And so the first thing I did when this campaign went live is I sent an email out to my email list saying, hey, here's this book, here's this pre-order campaign. If you're interested in this book, come and order a copy. And so instantly from my email list, I had, 50 sales the first day or something because of that email list. So that was really helpful. And if there was one thing I could do differently, I wish I would have been building my email list years before I started, because then maybe I could have sold all 500 within 24 hours instead of just 50.
That's interesting. From your perspective, it might be hard for you to answer this, but do you think that a writer of some nonfiction work would have to have the same resources that you had to make their pitch and their marketing campaign a success on Publicizer?
No, because I do most things wrong. So whatever I do, somebody else could do faster.
I find that surprising.
No, I make all the mistakes so that other people can learn from me and do it differently. So I feel like I do a lot of trial and error in what I do. I love experimenting. I love trying things out, but I spend a lot of time trying out things that don't work. And a lot of my content is in my newsletters, and what I post on LinkedIn is, it's the one time it worked out of the 20 times I tried and it didn't work. And so I say, hey, here's how you do this. Well, the the people don't see the 19 times I tried something else and it didn't work. So somebody can definitely go out and do it the right way the first time and spend a lot less time on these things than I did. And if I were advising somebody on how to prepare for a book launch, I'd say build that email list starting right now and build that as quickly as you can. And build that following up on LinkedIn if it's a nonfiction or a business book, because LinkedIn is just a fantastic platform these days for making connections. And so that's been huge for me. And but it's also just developing the relationships, the personal one-on-one relationships, the things that don't scale. That's where so much of my book sales, my business relationships have come from. The business that I bring in, the revenue that we generate, so much of that has come from people who say, hey, I've been following your content for the past 2 years. We've never spoken, but I've been following you and I'm ready to go with this. And I hear that over and over and over again. It's very rare that I get a client coming in saying, hey, I just heard about you last week and I want to engage your services. It's usually, I've been following you for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Those are the people who are buying today.
I suppose what I was getting at in my first question, Josh, when I asked you about the use of that platform, could someone have success with a nonfiction book if they didn't have a mailing list and they didn't have the breadth of connections that you have? Do you think they could still make a go of it?
I think so. Obviously, some of the success I had was because of the relationships in the newsletter and things that I already had in place. So my campaign raised, it was a little bit over $26,000 USD. So it was a very successful campaign for Publishizer. Most of their campaigns don't do that well. But at the same time, I think somebody could go out. There would have to be some clever marketing. It's not as though you can just use their platform and put your book up there and say, okay, here it is. The platform itself is not going to generate the traffic to get you to 500 pre-orders. If you just put it on the platform by itself, so Kickstarter is so big and they have so much traffic that it is possible to put something up on Kickstarter and maybe your marketing plan isn't all together, but because it's a great idea that really appeals to that audience and there's so much traffic on Kickstarter, something can be successful there. With Publishizer, they're a newer company, and so there's not a lot of traffic on the website already. So even if you have a great book that a lot of people would really be interested in, there just isn't enough traffic to produce the pre-orders that you're going to want. You have to drive traffic from somewhere else, whether that's a newsletter, whether that's social media. And so somebody could have success without doing what I did, but they would have to do something else. There'd have to be some PR campaign, Facebook ads, or something to drive traffic to that.
Well, that's great that you've shared that, Josh, because I'm sure a lot of people are now interested in using that platform, and it's important that they know, what's involved and how much work it is.
Yeah, because I did spend quite a bit of time I said most of the time went into setting up the platform, but yeah, I spent quite a bit of time outside of the platform doing the marketing as well.
An important part of making that campaign a success, obviously. Yeah. And so you mentioned that book will come out in May. Can you tell us a little bit about, a bit more about the content of the book? And also, how will you market it once it comes out? Will it simply go to the people who took advantage of the various offers on Publishizer? Or, will you work to sell additional copies as well?
I'll definitely work to sell additional copies. So, the book is coming out in 2020. It's called 60 Days to LinkedIn Mastery. And it's 60 quick tips on things that you can improve on LinkedIn, either to optimize your profile, make connections, or create content. And so if you go through one tip every day, you'll finish in 60 days. And by the end of that 60 days, you will literally be a master of LinkedIn compared to 99.99% of the people on LinkedIn. You'll know more than the vast majority of people who are using LinkedIn about how to use it the right way. So it's a quick and easy starter guide, you could say, to using LinkedIn. And hopefully through the pre-sale campaign. Of course, those people have already bought the book, but hopefully they'll tell other people about it and word will spread. But I'm also planning on doing a lot of campaigning on LinkedIn, a lot of posts there to drive traffic to it. I do public speaking. And so as I go out speaking, I'll be talking about the book. And there are a lot of other tactics. I don't expect this to be a huge bestseller or anything, but maybe it can be a category bestseller on Amazon, and that would be nice to get. But these days, you don't have to sell that many books to be a bestseller. I think the number is if you sell 3,000 books or something, then you'll get into bestseller categories on Amazon and such. So a lot of people think, oh, I got to sell 100,000 or 1,000,000 books to be a bestseller. No, 3,000 is around the limit that you need to be really outshining the vast. I mean, the most books that get published sell like 10 copies, and that's the family. So the vast majority of books don't sell that many copies. So if you sell 3,000 copies, you're doing really well with your book at that level. But a lot of people would be disappointed with that, right? But there are a lot of tactics out there that you can use to push more book sales. And Ryan Holiday is probably one of the best resources out there in terms of published content on how to orchestrate a book marketing campaign.
And I mean, there are lots of books and other resources as well, aren't there? You mentioned Ryan, but there's one person I like to read and follow is Jane Friedman. She has fantastic resources, and I think you've read her book as well, haven't you?
I do. I've got them on my shelf right here, and I subscribe to Jane's email newsletter, and she has got some great resources. She's a literary agent, and she knows the industry, and she has a lot of great tips for authors.
And I pre-ordered a copy of that book as well, so I can't wait to read it. Now, what have you been working on recently? It sounds like a fairly big project. I've seen you write about it, and I've seen some posts on Instagram. So tell us about that, Josh.
So my baby, the book that I really care about, that I feel like this is the big one, is called The 7 Systems of Influence. And I've been working on this for years before I ever had this idea for the LinkedIn book. And The 7 Systems of Influence, it started out as a book on thought leadership and personal branding, but it's turned into a lot more in the sense that we're all influencers and we all influence each other, whether we're parents or academics or researchers or executives or entrepreneurs. We all need influence because knowledge isn't enough. You can know everything, but until you influence somebody, nothing actually happens. So this book is about the science of influence, how we influence each other and how we make things happen in the real world. And so it goes through these 7 systems with the idea that if you have all these systems running well, then you get influence. If one of these systems isn't working the right way, then you're going to find that your influence and your impact are lessened. And so this book goes through these 7 systems and talks about how they work and how you can get them working together so that you can make the kind of impact that you want to make on the world.
How did you decide, Josh, that, this kind of set of information or this knowledge constitutes a system? And, how did you decide that would be included in the book?
When I was writing for Forbes and I got these amazing results from writing for Forbes, that's what really got me interested in this. And I started thinking, how did this happen? And I mean, it happened on accident, but if I wanted to do this on purpose, how would I go about doing it? And some of my marketing background came to play. It's pretty basic in marketing to talk about, well, what's your brand and who's your audience and what kind of content will trigger your audience and get them to react to what you want them to do. So this whole idea of marketing funnels and marketing plans and branding, this is all floating out there. And nothing that's in my book is necessarily new, except for the way that I've structured it and the way I've put things together. I've never seen it organized the same way before, but all the individual concepts, they're all out there floating around. I just organize them in a certain way that makes sense to me and I hope will make sense to other people. And so some of it came from the marketing background. And then as I started looking at this, I realized, this isn't a process. It's not like you start at A and go through A, B, C, D, E, and then at the end you get influence. It's really You start at A, you go to B, then you go back to A, then you go to C, then you're doing D, and then a month later you come back and you work on C again, and then you go to the next. And so I realized it's not a series of steps. It's not a formula per se. It's really kind of like independent systems. It's like a car. You've got your propulsion system, your combustion system, your steering system. You have all these different systems, and one of them doesn't come before the other. They all work together to move that car from point A to point B. And that's how I saw these systems of influence, that people needed to constantly be thinking about them the same way that I was always thinking about them and saying, hey, I'm writing for Forbes, so I'm creating content. That's system number 4, content. And I'm taking action. That's system number 5. I am getting these articles written. I have a plan to get these articles out there. But that wasn't enough because I didn't know who my audience was. Audience is system number 3. And so once I figured out who my audience was, and I figured out what do I really have to offer them, that's Genius Zone, that's system number 2, then I started creating content that activated my audience and got them to do what I wanted them to do, which was to contact my marketing agency and inquire for more information. And that's when it led to $10 million in revenue. So once I had the systems working the right way together, I got amazing results. But before that, I got 0 results, even though I had most of the systems working correctly. But it was kind of like trying to drive a car, but not having it in gear. You're just sitting there in neutral and, hey, everything's working, but the gears aren't going together. And so you're not actually moving.
You named maybe 4 or 5 of the systems there. Take us through the systems, Josh. What are they?
Sure. So number 1 is vision. So that's your dream. That's your goal. That's what you want to accomplish. For me, when I started writing for Forbes, my vision was I want to save my business and hopefully grow my business. So that was my vision at the time. Number 2 is Genius Zone. So that's what you know. And it's the unique combination of skills and experience and knowledge you have and how those overlap to make you truly unique. So for me, my unique Genius Zone when I was writing for Forbes was I run a marketing agency and I know how to write and I'm on Forbes and I have an ability to share information in a way that connects with people. And I was sharing information specific to digital marketing. And so that overlap in that channel all combined to provide something that was unique for my audience. Now, who was my audience? My audience was people who are trying to hire a marketing agency. That was my ideal audience. And then system number 4 is content. System number 5 is action. That's the plan you have to actually produce that content, get it out there. And then 6 and 7 are actually my favorites. System number 6 is collaboration. So that is, how do you work with other people to get way more impact than you would ever be able to do on your own? So for me, I collaborated with Forbes, I collaborated with my publisher, I collaborated with the people I interviewed for my articles or interviewed for my book. That's all forms of collaboration. And we always collaborate. Even if you look at Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, you think, well, she was just an author. She wrote that great book all by herself. She didn't collaborate with anybody. But in her case, she wasn't writing the book until she had 2 friends who came along and said, hey, we know there's a great book in you, and we're going to pay for you to take a year off of work so that you can write your book. So they collaborated with her. And if they hadn't, we wouldn't know about that book. So even in the case of a solo author writing their own book, you're still going to collaborate with people. You need other people to help you. But if you really focus on how do I build a tribe, how do I build a larger audience, then your influence can spread so much further. And then finally, system 7 is love, which is passion, empathy, and goodwill. Passion meaning you're excited about your content. You're excited about what you're doing, about your vision, about your audience, about interacting with them. Empathy means that you understand them. And this is something that came out of writing chief marketing officers at work. I realized all these top marketers, they really understand their audience. They know their audience so well that they don't have to go do a focus group. They know what these people want to buy before even those people know what they want to buy. And that's what made these people such great marketers, was that empathy with their audience. And then finally, goodwill. If I'm creating content, but I don't really care about my audience and I don't care for their well-being, then it's just a transaction. It's just to make money or to get them to do what I want them to do. And that shows through in your content. People see right through that, and then you don't have the influence that you could have. Whereas on the other hand, if the goodwill is there, if people sense that you really care about them and you want what's good for them, then you can almost do everything else wrong and you'll still make an impact as long as you have that goodwill part of that love system there.
That's so interesting. And I guess with the goodwill part, most people can sniff out the lack of authenticity, or if someone really doesn't care, or if someone thinks, oh, it's just about the money for me, nothing else. They're going to have a sense of that, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. There's this guy, Tom Bilyeu, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he's got kind of a podcast / interview show that he does, super successful entrepreneur. And the other day he said he was talking about how one of the biggest regrets he had from his career as an entrepreneur was that in the early years, he focused too much on making money. And when he stopped focusing on the money and he started focusing on the people and serving people, then number one, he was happier, but number two, he was also more successful financially. And I've seen this in my own life, my own entrepreneurial experience, and I've seen it in others. I think most people are more successful when they care about the people that they're serving. And I definitely think people have more fun and find more fulfillment when they're serving for the right reasons. Money just really isn't that big a deal when you actually achieve success and you get the money, you realize it's not as much about the money as I thought it was. It's really, there's got to be something more than just making the money. Money's nice, but money is certainly not everything.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we can't live without it, can we? And, you need it to put a roof over your head, to feed your children, all the things that we need to do, and then the things that we want to do.
Right. But yeah, it's kind of like, we're not made to make money. I mean, we need money to survive just the same way that our bodies need food to survive. But if you said that your body exists to eat food, that would be kind of a short-sighted use of your body. Our body exists to do so many more things than just eat food. Food's definitely important. Money's important for our lives, but there's so much more after that.
Of course, yeah. Now, I'm kind of curious about a point that you made maybe, I don't know, roughly 5-10 minutes ago. And it was interesting. You said that the research that you did on the book and on your book, your latest book, The 7 Systems of Influence, and you said something like, everything's already out there. I just kind of put it together in a way that it's never been put together before. But what about, your touch or your influence on that material, Josh? I mean, you must have shaped it in some way with perhaps your own philosophy, your own wisdom, your own life experiences. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, and this is something that I try to talk to my coaching clients and people in my masterminds about, people who are consuming my content, is that it doesn't matter if somebody else has already said what you want to say. Maybe 10,000 people have already said what you want to say, but nobody's said it the way that you're going to say it. Nobody has the same experiences. And so, yes, my book has my unique touch, my stories, my take on it. And so that is important to it, but I want to give credit where credit's due. It's like Isaac Newton said. He said that he stood on the shoulders of giants with all the creations and amazing discoveries that he made. But we're all building on what somebody else has done before us. I love looking at those videos on how things are made in factories, and you see these complex machines creating candy or whatever it is. And you think, who invented this machine? I mean, who could sit down and design that machine? Well, nobody did. Somebody invented something very simple, and then somebody else came along and modified that just a little bit to be a little bit better. And somebody else came along and modified that, and somebody else came along and added this thing here and that thing there. And you do that for 50 years with dozens of people, and you end up with this really complex machine that no one person ever could have designed or built. And that's kind of how I feel about my book, is that I didn't create this. I never could have created this, but I'm building on what a lot of people have done before me. I'm taking ideas from the Stoics 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. I'm taking ideas from people in the Middle Ages during the Renaissance period. I'm taking things from Dale Carnegie's book, How to Make Friends, Win Friends, and Influence People. So I'm taking ideas from all these people who have gone before me and putting these together in a way that I hope people look at and read and say, oh, I never thought of it this way. And now that I think of it this way, I know what I need to do to get the results that are going to give me what I want.
It's very much like the Buddhist view, isn't it? The interconnectedness of everything. Yes. And, nothing kind of stands or exists on its own.
Right. There is no such thing as a self-made man. I mean, we all are building on what somebody before us has done. We are all the recipients of more help than we deserve. That's just life.
Now, would you say that the timing kind of came together on this book because you've done so much writing and so much work that you'd finally found your voice? Does it feel like that?
It does. And the way that I knew I was onto something with this book is I started testing it out very early on and saying, hey, I think I found some systems here. And when I started out, I think I had 5 systems or something. And I started posting about this on LinkedIn and saying, hey, I've got these systems of influence. What do people think of this? And people would give me feedback. And immediately people were interested in it. And I was getting a reaction that I hadn't gotten from other content before. So I thought, I'm kind of onto something here. And I kept refining that and researching it and adding things. It took me a long time to figure out system number 7 was love. I kept thinking maybe it's mindset, maybe it's attitude. I knew there was something missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so I kept trying. And then once I got these 7 as they're organized now, it really kind of popped and people started saying, when is this book coming out? Or I started having people email me and they're like, I can't find your book. Where's your book? I'm like, I don't have it yet. I'm just working on it. I just have an idea for a book right now. But that's when I knew I'm onto something here because people are trying to get my book and it doesn't even exist yet. So I know that there's something good there if the idea of the book is catchy enough that people are going on Amazon and searching for it already.
And that's pretty smart to test out the content. Would you recommend that to aspiring writers or authors?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's such a waste of time to write a huge book and put a ton of effort into it and then find out that nobody is interested when it's so easy to go on social media. And maybe your audience is on Facebook, maybe they're on Twitter, maybe they're on Instagram. Mine happens to be mostly business people right now, so I use LinkedIn. But I go out there and I test out everything because I can go out on LinkedIn and I can write a post in 5 minutes and test out one little part of my book and see how people respond to that. And if I get a good response, then I say, hey, maybe I should include this in the book. Maybe I need to modify this if I don't get a good response. And then maybe I'll repost it later in a modified way to see if I get a better response. But I'm constantly testing things out, writing them as LinkedIn posts or blog posts or sending things out in my newsletter. And I see what kind of response and feedback I get. And if I send out a newsletter and nobody emails me back, I think, oh, okay, maybe that was good, maybe it wasn't. But if I send an email out and I get people responding saying, this is a game changer for me, I never thought about this way, thank you so much, this is fantastic, then I know, okay, that's something I definitely need to put in the book. And that's a very cheap experiment for me to perform to get that validation.
Are you actually emailing content to close contacts or good friends and saying, hey, would you mind taking a look at this? Have you ever done that as well?
I do a little bit of that, but I always try to test things out at a little bit of more scale. So my email newsletter, I'll send things out there. I've got my mastermind groups where I test things out more in depth with people. We really dig into their lives and their vision and what they're trying to accomplish. And I test things out there. I test things out on coworkers and business partners. I just did this today with my partners at MWI, where I walked them through a 2-hour exercise with the 7 systems of influence and tested it out with them. And it worked out great. And we had some breakthroughs and made some decisions about things we want to change with the business because of that. And so I'm constantly testing things out with people. But the more people I can test it out with, the better, because I feel like I get a larger sample size, at least with certain things. Some things I like to test out one-on-one with people. Other things I like to send out to thousands of people and say, what do you think? And see what kind of response I get back from the group.
And with the 7 systems of influence, do you see this book having a broader appeal beyond business people?
I hope so. Some people might be reminded of another book with 7 in the title, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And yeah, I definitely was thinking of that when I was coming up with that. And I thought, in fact, I first wanted to call the book The 7 Systems of Highly Influential People. And I just knew that was inviting a lawsuit. And also it would just, it would just sound like a ripoff. And I thought, I can't do that. But there are 7 systems. And so I thought, what kind of title can I come up with? And I thought, The 7 Systems of Influence, I think that's safe and nobody's going to say you ripped off Stephen R. Covey with that. But when I look at the 7 Habits, I do kind of look at that book as a model for what I want to do, in that the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People was a business book, but it did have broader appeal, and it ended up going throughout society, and so many people who are not executives or entrepreneurs have read that book. And that's what I'm hoping this book becomes, because what honestly gets me the most excited about this book is thinking about parents reading it. I'm a dad. I have 3 kids. I'm using the 7 Systems of Influence in my family to think about, okay, who's my ideal audience? It's my kids. And what kind of content am I creating for them? How am I delivering that content? Is that love factor there? Do they sense that from me so that they trust me and will actually pay attention to this? And what's my action plan? So I'm using these systems with my kids for my example, for my words, what I speak, how I interact with them. And it helps me there. And so I think about that and I think, wow, I want to write another version of this book. Maybe after the first one, maybe I'll do a 7 Systems of Influence for Parents or something, because it's those relationships that really matter. That's where I see the biggest impact in the future from this.
Wow, that sounds great. It does sound exciting. I've no doubt that parents will want to read it, or, anyone who is a co-parent, or, they have stepchildren or anything like that. It would be invaluable.
I hope so. I hope I do a decent enough job with. I don't feel like I created this. I feel like somebody gave this to me, like God gave this to me. I just hope I do a good enough job explaining it and writing about it that people understand it. Because I know fundamentally it works. The question is whether I can do a good enough job as the person delivering it, as the messenger, to get people interested in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people who've done, some very good or great work have felt like it's somehow come to them. So, I mean, that says a lot about the work, doesn't it?
I hope so. It's interesting you mentioned that. I'm not a fan of Stephen King. I'm not really into the horror genre, but you can't dispute that guy has sold a lot of books. And I listened to an interview somebody did with him several years ago, and he said that all of his books, they just flowed into his head, and he was just the medium. He was just the writing it down, but he felt like he wasn't actually creating the stories or coming up with the stories. They just flowed through him. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of his horror works, but some of his other books are really good. Like The Green Mile, and that book about, the guy who traveled back in time to see if he could save Kennedy from assassination. I think it's 22/11/63. Oh, that is such a page turner, that book. And he's a brilliant storyteller.
He is. And one of his books is one of my favorite books, but it's his book called On Writing, which is half biography. So it's his life. And then half of it is his writing tips. Mm-hmm. And that book, I am always recommending that to people who ask what writing books I recommend. It's my favorite book about the craft of writing. And it really made me like him as a person. I don't like his writing still, but as a person, I love him because I read his story and I thought, wow, this guy has really been through some tough times, some hard things. And he's a survivor, and he persisted and he endured through hard times. And I think once you really know somebody, it's very hard to not like somebody that you really know. And this book, I just felt like I knew him. I felt like, man, if I met this guy in person, I'd want to give him a hug, even though I hate his books. But then the second part about how to write was it was such good advice, just practical, useful advice.
Yeah, that's great. Now, we've talked quite a bit about your upcoming book, and I'm sure there'll be listeners who are going to be really intrigued and they're going to want to know more. So, do you have a publisher for the 7 Systems of Influence, and when might it be available for people to buy?
I don't have a publisher yet, and this is kind of secret, so don't tell anybody this, but the LinkedIn book was a project to test out the publishing industry and test out a publisher and see if I liked working with them. So I'm working with this publisher right now. If everything goes well with the LinkedIn book, then I'll probably work with them on the 7 Systems book. If I don't have such a great experience with them, then I'll be shopping for a different publisher for the 7 Systems.
When do you think your book will come out, The 7 Systems of Influence?
I don't know when it will come out, but I am committed to finishing writing it this year. So unless something really big interferes in my life, I am going to get this book done because the framework's there, a lot of the content's there. It's really just a matter of me sitting down and holing up for a month or two and just cranking it out. I mean, because I've been researching this for years. So the content is well thought out. It's well researched. It's just a matter of putting it all together in book form.
Will it be quite a thick book?
I'm debating on that because I've read some thinner books lately that I really enjoyed and felt like they just got to the point. And I want this to be something that is useful to people. And so I'm kind of more inclined to make it thinner and not fill it up with so many examples and so many stories, because I want people to be able to read it really quick, really easily, and say, wow, this is a great, really useful book, and then recommend it to their friends. I'm finding that word of mouth is really the key. If you can't get word of mouth with a book, it's not going to spread. But if you can get word of mouth, you really don't have to do any other marketing if you can get the word of mouth going strongly enough.
Josh, can you tell us, I know that when you published CMOs at Work, it was in a number of different formats, wasn't it? And is this something that you still believe in? Do you believe in publishing the hard copy, the audio version, and the ebook?
Yes, because everybody has different preferences, right, about how they prefer to consume content. I went for years only reading audiobooks. I read hundreds of audiobooks. I just didn't have time to sit down and pick up a print book, or at least I didn't think I had time. And so I would read while I was commuting or exercising or doing other things. And so when I created Chief Marketing Officers at Work, I thought, okay, I am definitely doing an audiobook because that's how I consume. And curiously, what's interesting is I've made more money off the audiobook than the print or Kindle versions by a long shot. So that turned out to be a good move. But I know a lot of people who prefer Kindle, and I know a lot of people who prefer print books. And now I've actually gotten back into reading print books, and I've got several print books throughout my house in different places that I'm using. And so for me, it's if you want to get your message to the people, you've got to put the message out in a form that they want to consume.
Josh, is it a different experience for you, reading as opposed to listening?
For me, I would say it's usually the same. But there are certain books that I feel like if you don't listen to it, you're really missing out. I mean, for example, the Harry Potter series, the narrator is so good on those audiobooks that if you only read the book, you're actually really missing out because the narrator is so good at acting out the different voices and such. And I do really like to listen to books when it's read by the author. So if I'm reading something by Ryan Holiday or Gary Vaynerchuk, I really like to hear what they have to say, especially people like Gary Vaynerchuk, because he breaks out of the book all the time and adds in little extra things in there. So I love reading or listening to those books. But if it's read by a narrator who is hired on, and it's not an acting type of book where the voices really matter or something, then it's not as critical for me to listen to it. And then listening is really more just a matter of convenience. But my problem is some people say, oh, I can't listen to audiobooks. I lose focus. I lose concentration. I find that it's easier for me to concentrate on listening than on the printed book. I find that when I'm reading a printed book, maybe this has happened to you, but you're reading and all of a sudden you realize that you've turned 10 pages and you have no idea what you read on those 10 pages, but you've been sitting there for a half hour reading, but your mind was somewhere else. That happens to me all the time and I have to go back and start again. But I find with the audio, it tends to catch me and I say, oh, wait, I just missed something there, and it just keeps me on track.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that I have to tell myself to stay focused. If for example, if I'm driving and I've got a podcast in and the traffic's pretty busy in Toronto, I'm obviously going to focus on my driving, and then I lose track. So for me, that might not be the best time to be listening to something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I went through this. Yeah, I went through this phase where I listened to lots of Charles Dickens, and I can totally agree. The animation in the reader's voice and the different accents or the different kind of types of voices for all the characters, it was very colorful. So I love that. Mm-hmm. And with nonfiction, I feel like I tend to remember a bit more if I do have a print copy.
Yeah, it's all our brains work in different ways, though, right? So it's to each his own, and whatever works for everybody. But if there's somebody out there who's never listened to an audiobook and doesn't think it would work, at least try it out. Give it a try. You might love it.
And Josh, if we have any questions from listeners who just starting to work on a book, or they have a question, are you okay for us to send them to you, and you might take a look at them and answer them?
Oh yeah, for sure. You can contact me on LinkedIn, or you can find me through my website and contact me through there. So I love getting questions. It's often the questions I get are what becomes my next newsletter or my next blog post, because I start responding to somebody and then I think, oh, this is practically a whole blog post I'm writing for them. I might as well just write the blog post. And so oftentimes people will email me a question and then they get a whole blog post in return. And I say, thank you for the idea. I wrote this whole blog post for you.
That's good. Okay. So, Josh, we've talked a lot about your writing, and you know so much. You're so experienced. You're on to your third book now. I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure everyone who aspires to write would like to ask you. What guidance can you give them? What can writers do to kind of get on the right track to try and be successful?
The number one thing I believe you have to do to be a successful writer is to read a lot. I grew up with a love of reading. I owe that to my mom. My mom, when I was a little kid, she would read to me every single night. She'd sit at the edge of my bed and read me book after book after book. And I just learned to love reading. And as I grew up, my mom was always taking me to the library. When we went by the bookstore at the mall, any book I wanted to buy, it was mine. It was the one thing that I could have unlimited, as many as I wanted, was books. And because I read so much, those sentence structures and the way that language is supposed to sound, that's just ingrained in my head. I don't think about it. I was terrible in English class when I was going to school. I would go to grammar class or English class and I did terrible on the tests. But if they said, hey, creative writing time, go write something, then that was a piece of cake for me, because I just knew what sounded good. I knew what sounded right. And the only reason I knew what sounded right was because I had read so much and consumed so much material. So I still do a lot of reading. I read anywhere from 50 to 100 or more books per year. I am constantly reading articles all the time, and it's just part of my life. And so that makes the writing easy. I don't have to worry about the technical aspect of the writing so much, because that flows. I just have to come up with the ideas. So that's my number one advice. My number two advice would be practice. Keep on writing. Keep on doing more of it. It doesn't matter if it's terrible at first. You can always edit and go back and fix it.
It sounds like you really have a strong understanding. It's almost kind of innate for you. You understand the rhythm of the language.
Yeah, and I think some people might look at my writing and the way I write and say, oh, he's a natural writer. I don't see it that way at all. I just see that I made a huge investment over the past 44 years of my life to consume so much content that now it looks easy, but really that's just the result of making a sustained investment for all these decades.
And that's the same with anything, isn't it, really? You know, it's like when we see someone play the piano really well, or we see a carpenter work on something, and we think, oh, that is easy. And it's not. It's the sustained effort over a long period of time.
Yep. I'm reading a great book right now called The Talent Code. And that book has really opened my eyes to how people learn and how people develop their talents. And it's really been interesting for me to think about my writing ability in view of what he talks about in the Talent Code. and makes me realize that anybody, really think anybody who doesn't have some sort of disability or something, but any person with a brain that can function to write something can improve upon that skill and can become an excellent writer if they focus on writing the right way. And if you want to know how to write the right way, you go and you read the great books, the classics, the books that, well, most of the books that are bestsellers. Sometimes there are bestsellers that aren't that great, but most of the bestsellers are pretty good books. But you go out and you read great books, and as long as you consume a lot of that content, you'll get a sense for that. And then the writing really does become easy.
Josh, I'm pretty sure I read this in a newsletter. I could be wrong, but I know that you never only have one book on the go at a single time. You usually have like maybe 3, 4, or even 5. So as well as the Talent Code, what else are you reading right now?
Oh, I'm reading a biography of General George Marshall, who was a general for he was the chief of staff for the U.S. military during World War II. That's a super interesting book. I love history. I'm also reading Future Shock by, I want to say Poe Bronson.
Oh, Alvin Toffler.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was the other author, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to remember that name.
Well, what made you go back and read Future Shock? That's interesting.
Because of work that I'm doing in the educational space, that was one of the recommended books on somebody's list. And I thought, I need to go read that because that has to do with education. I'm reading another book called Unschooled by Carrie McDonald, which is a new book about unschooling and homeschooling and self-directed learning for children. And that's an excellent book also within the educational space.
Oh, that's great. And can you tell us before we finish here with our conversation, which it will be great to continue, and I'm sure we will at another time, where can listeners find you and where could they sign up to your newsletter if they want to?
Best place is my website, which is joshsteimle.com.
Oh, that's great. And we'll include that in the show notes as well. Well, Josh, it's been fantastic talking to you this evening. I'm so glad that we were able to find the time to connect.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on, Sheila. It was a pleasure to talk with you.